Welcome to my philosophy channel. In 1905, a 30-year-old man sat at the peak of European intellectual life. Doctorates in philosophy and theology, a post as principal of a theological college, a reputation as one of the finest organists alive. He had published books that shifted how scholars read the New Testament. And then, without warning, he enrolled in medical school. Not to add another credential, to disappear into the African jungle and treat strangers he had never met. Everyone he loved told him he was throwing his life away. This video runs a little long. If you stay with me to the end, you might see what it costs a person to take their own conscience seriously and what it gives back. Chapter 1. The Dust on the Glove. A woman's hand covers a small boy's mouth. The hand wears a knitted glove, gray with age, and the boy can taste the dust in its fibers. He is sitting in a church pew in a valley town called Günzbach, in the disputed borderland of Alsace, and his father is delivering the Sunday sermon. The boy has yawned. The nanny's reflex is automatic. Decades later, the boy, now an old man in an African hospital, will say he can still smell that glove. Albert Schweitzer was born on January 14, 1875, in Kaisersberg, a small town in Upper Alsace where his father Louis served as the Lutheran pastor to a modest Protestant congregation in a predominantly Catholic community. His mother, Adele, née Schillinger, came from a line of pastors and organists. The family moved to Günzbach when Albert was 6 months old, and it was there, in a valley flanked by vineyards and quiet churches, that he spent his childhood among 4 siblings. Alsace was a land that belonged to everyone and no one. Seized by Prussia in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, it had been French for centuries before that. The children spoke Alsatian dialect at home, French in the street, German in school. Alphonse Daudet's short story, The Last Lesson, about a town forced to stop teaching French, was set in this region. Schweitzer grew up on soil where identity itself was a wound that never fully closed, and where loyalty to a single flag was a luxury no one could afford. The church in Günzbach held a strange arrangement. Protestants and Catholics shared the same building, praying at different hours on Sundays, a compromise born from the Reformation and the 30 Years' War. The boy absorbed this without knowing its name. Tolerance was not a theory in his household. It was the architecture of the room where he learned to pray. What troubled young Albert was not theology. It was clothing. His mother, believing that a pastor's eldest son should look respectable, had a coat made for him from his father's old fabric. The village boys did not wear coats. When Sunday came and he was told to put it on, he refused. His father slapped him across the face. He still refused. They went to church without the coat. He never wore it once. On another occasion, his mother took him to a shop in Kaisersberg to buy a hat. She chose a fashionable one with a brim. The shopkeeper praised it. Albert stood rigid with distress. The village boys wore plain gray caps with ear flaps. He whispered that he wanted one of those. The shopkeeper, puzzled, dug through a pile of cheap, outdated stock and produced the right kind. He put it on immediately, radiant with relief. These were not tantrums. They were early experiments in a question that would shape his life. What does it mean to live as though you are no different from the people around you? He did not want to be the pastor's son. He wanted to be one of the farmer's children. Mud on his shoes, no distinction in the eyes of the other boys. The desire was fierce enough to survive beatings, enough to override the approval of every adult in the room. His mother Adele was not a passive woman. Years later, when the Dreyfus affair split France in two, she published a fiery article in a Protestant newspaper defending the wrongly accused Jewish captain, and signed it, pastor's wife, daughter, sister, and mother. The instinct for justice in this family was not Albert's invention. It was inherited, carried in the bloodline alongside the music and the sermons, passed down like a hymn whose words no one needed to look up. The boy who refused the coat would grow into a man who refused something far larger. But the logic was the same. If the distinction is false, do not wear it. If the privilege is unearned, do not accept it. And if the people you love punish you for this, absorb the blow and keep standing. The dust on that glove never quite washed off. Chapter 2. The Smile on the Bridge. A donkey comes slowly down the road toward Gunsbach. On its back sits an old Jewish man named Mausch, a cattle trader from the neighboring village. He has made this trip many times. He will make it many more, and every time the children of the town run behind him, shouting his name like an insult. Mausch, Mausch, Jew Mausch. It is the late 1880s. In Alsace, as in much of Europe, being Jewish means being available for casual cruelty. Albert Schweitzer is among the children. He does not want to shout. He has no hatred for the old man. But the other boys are shouting. And to remain silent would be to mark himself, again as different. The pastor's son. The boy who will not wear the coat cannot also be the boy who will not mock the Jew. That would be too much strangeness for one childhood to carry. He opens his mouth and joins them. Mauschy does not flinch. He does not speed up or slow down. He rides through the village with a patience that seems older than any individual life, as if it were a skill inherited over centuries. Occasionally he turns his head and offers the children a smile. Embarrassed, gentle, free of malice, he does not argue, he does not weep. He gives them, without knowing it, a lesson in what a human being can absorb and still remain whole. One afternoon, standing on the bridge at the edge of town, Schweitzer sees the smile again and something breaks open. Not anger. Recognition. A man can be persecuted and still choose silence. He can be surrounded by cruelty and respond with a composure so absolute that it shames every voice raised against him. The boy does not have the vocabulary for what he is witnessing. He only knows that from this day forward, he will greet Mauschy with respect whenever their paths cross. Years pass. In high school, when Schweitzer comes home for holidays and encounters the old trader on the road, he walks beside him and takes his hand. They walk together for a while, the tall student and the bent old man, not saying much. Mausch never learns what he means to the boy. This Jewish old man, Schweitzer, will write much later, certainly did not know what he meant to me. But every time Schweitzer feels anger rising in him, the impulse to lash out, to humiliate, to win, he thinks of that face on the donkey, and the rage subsides. This was not a conversion. It was a crack in the surface of the world, through which something deeper became briefly visible. Dignity is not contingent on power. A man without status, without protection, without even the ability to stop children from taunting him, can possess something that the children themselves lack. Mausch carried it on his donkey like an invisible cargo, more valuable than anything he bought or sold. Schweitzer was growing up in a family where justice was not abstract. His mother would soon write her public defense of Captain Dreyfus, the Jewish officer falsely convicted of treason by the French military in a scandal that tore the nation apart. Adele Schweitzer did not equivocate. She did not hide behind anonymity. She signed her name and every role she held, daring anyone to argue with a woman who was simultaneously a pastor's wife, a pastor's daughter, a pastor's sister, and a pastor's mother. The household breathed resistance to prejudice the way other households breathed cooking smoke. But it was Mausch, not his mother, who gave Schweitzer the image he could not forget. There is a difference between arguing for justice and embodying it. Adele argued. Mausch simply was. His silence on that donkey, his refusal to mirror the violence aimed at him, became a permanent resident in Schweitzer's memory. A quiet checkpoint through which every future impulse had to pass before it could become action. Decades later, in a jungle hospital on the banks of the Ogowe River, Schweitzer will face provocations far greater than a child's taunt. Patients who refuse treatment, families who distrust him, colonial officials who see him as an inconvenience. In each encounter, somewhere behind his eyes, an old man rides a donkey through a small town and smiles at the children who curse him. Some teachers never stand at a lectern. Some lessons never make it into a book. Chapter 3, The Organ and the Argument. A boy of 8 sits at a pipe organ in the village church, his feet barely reaching the pedals. He stretches his legs downward, the tips of his shoes grazing the wooden boards, and presses. A sound rises through the nave, enormous, older than anything he has known. It fills the stone walls the way water fills a glass, completely, leaving no room for silence. He does not yet understand what he is hearing. He only knows he wants to live inside it. Music entered Schweitzer's life before ideas did. His father taught him piano on a battered instrument inherited from his maternal grandfather, a man whose improvisations on the organ were famous across the Munster Valley. The grandfather had not only played organs, he built them. When he heard that a new instrument had been installed in a church in Lucerne, he traveled there just to watch the assembly. The obsession was structural, not merely aesthetic. He wanted to know how the sound was made, how air became voice, how mechanics could produce something that felt like prayer. At 7, Schweitzer startled his school teacher by adding original harmonies to hymns on a small classroom harmonium. At 9, he substituted for the regular organist during a church service. At 15, he began formal instruction with Eugene Munch in Mulhouse, who opened the door to Johann Sebastian Bach. The encounter with Bach was not a musical preference. It was an intellectual event, Bach's fugues. Those layered, interlocking arguments in sound, where independent voices pursue their own logic yet resolve into a single architecture, gave Schweitzer a model for how truth might work. Not as a single melody, but as many voices held in tension. A Paris uncle's generosity sent him to study under Charles-Marie Widor, the great French organist, who normally accepted only conservatory students. Widor listened to the young Alsatian play and admitted him on the spot. Under Widor's guidance, Schweitzer's technique sharpened, but something more important emerged. The conviction that performing Bach was not about displaying skill. It was about recovering what the composer had meant. The notes on the page were a code. The performer's job was archaeological, to dig beneath the surface and retrieve the original intention buried under centuries of misinterpretation. This same instinct drove him in theology. At the University of Strasbourg, where he enrolled in 1893 to study both philosophy and theology, Schweitzer fixated on a question that most scholars considered settled. Who was the historical Jesus? The prevailing view among liberal theologians was that Jesus could be understood as a moral teacher, a reasonable figure compatible with modern values. Schweitzer read the Gospels with the same precision he brought to Bach's scores, and concluded that the scholars were wrong. They had built a Jesus in their own image, rational, moderate, European, and ignored the apocalyptic urgency in the original texts. During these same years, the quiet boy of Günzbach became almost unbearable at dinner parties. The adolescent who had once been too shy to speak now argued with adults as though they were classmates, interrupting, correcting, insisting on precision. his great-aunt, scolded him for rudeness. His father, taking him to social events, made him promise beforehand, "Albert, do not say foolish things. Do not ruin the evening." He was not trying to be rude. He was trying to reach the bottom of things, and the bottom always seemed to be one uncomfortable sentence further down than anyone else was willing to go. By 16, he learned to restrain himself. He sat through conversations full of polite evasions and shallow pleasantries and said nothing. Outwardly, he had returned to good manners. Inwardly, he was in revolt. For the sake of good breeding, he would later write, "People sacrifice honesty and the pursuit of truth." The social world demanded that you sand down every sharp edge of your thinking before presenting it. Schweitzer found this unbearable, like being asked to play Bach with the lower registers removed. He never fully resolved this tension. For the rest of his life, whenever he met someone willing to argue seriously, to push back, to demand evidence, to treat a conversation as something that mattered, he reverted instantly to the teenager at the dinner table. The years of restraint fell away. He forgot his age, forgot his status, forgot everything except the joy of two minds pressing against the same question until something gave. The organ and the argument were never separate pursuits. They were the same hand reaching for the same thing. A structure beneath the surface, a truth that would hold. Chapter 4. The Morning Vow. A young man lies in bed in his parents' house in Günzbach. It is the summer of 1896. He is 21 years old. Sunlight presses against the curtains. Outside, birds are calling in the valley. The same valley where he learned to walk, where the vineyards climb the hillsides in orderly green rows. He has come home from the university for the holidays, and for a few weeks the weight of Strasbourg, the lectures, the exams, the relentless accumulation of knowledge has been set aside. He is happy. That is the problem. He has a scholarship, a brilliant academic future, a gift for music that opens doors across Europe, and a circle of teachers who see in him something rare. He knows, with the clarity that sometimes arrives in the first minutes of waking, that millions of people will never have what he has, not because they lack ability, but because the machinery of the world is arranged to keep them outside the rooms where ability is recognized and rewarded. The thought does not arrive as guilt. It arrives as arithmetic. He has been given more than he needs. The surplus must go somewhere. Lying in that bed, listening to the birds, he makes a private bargain with his own life. Until the age of 30, he will pursue scholarship and music without apology. After 30, he will dedicate himself to direct service, not through writing, not through preaching, but through physical, personal, hands-on work for people who are suffering. He does not yet know what form this will take. He only knows the deadline. Most people have made a version of this promise. Someday I will do the meaningful thing. Someday I will stop accumulating and start giving. The genius of Schweitzer's vow was not its content. It was the fact that he kept it. For 9 years, he worked as though the clock were running. He obtained his doctorate in philosophy in 1899, writing on Kant's religious philosophy. The following year, he earned his theology degree. He was appointed to preach at St. Nicholas Church in Strasbourg, and soon became principal of the Theological College of St. Thomas. He published The Quest of the Historical Jesus, a book that redrew the boundaries of New Testament scholarship. Each achievement was real. None of it was positioning. He threw himself into theology and music with the intensity of someone who knows that the window is closing. He studied counterpoint with Gustav Jakobsthal. He traveled to Bayreuth to hear Wagner's Ring cycle and starved himself for days because a friend had given him a ticket, but he could not afford the train fare. He wrote a French monograph on Bach that would later expand into an 800-page German masterwork. He gave organ recitals across Europe. He was, by any external measure, a man in full flight. And beneath all of it, the Morning Vow sat like a stone at the bottom of a clear river, always visible, never moved by the current above. He had read the words of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it." For years, this passage had circled in his mind without settling. That summer morning in Günzbach, it settled. He did not speak about the vow. He told no one except a single trusted friend. He understood instinctively that announcing a sacrifice in advance converts it into performance. The promise had to remain private, a conversation between himself and whatever he meant by God, or it would lose its weight. Silence was not modesty, it was structural. The vow needed darkness to grow in, the way certain seeds require burial before they can break the surface. The 9 years passed. The clock ran down. On an autumn day in 1904, sitting at his desk in the theological college, Schweitzer picked up a green-covered magazine from the Paris Missionary Society. An article by Alfred Bogner described the desperate need for medical help in the Congo. The final sentence read, "Any person, man or woman, who can respond to the call, 'Lord, I am coming,' will be the one the church needs." He read it, set down the magazine, and felt something he had not expected. Not excitement, not dread, calm. The Morning Vow had found its address. Chapter 5. The Letters from the Yellow Mailbox. A man stands on a Paris boulevard in October 1905. He is 30 years old. In his hand are several envelopes. Some are addressed to his parents, some to close friends. One is a resignation letter. He drops them, one by one, into the mouth of a cast-iron mailbox. The metal lid swings shut with a sound that means nothing to the passers-by and everything to him. By the time these letters arrive, his life as Europe knows it will be over. The letters announced that Albert Schweitzer would begin studying medicine that winter, with the intention of becoming a doctor in equatorial Africa. He would resign his position at the Theological College of St. Thomas. He would step away from preaching at St. Nicholas Church. He would set aside, for the foreseeable future, the academic and musical career that had consumed his 20s. He included no request for permission. He was not asking. He was informing. The responses arrived like a series of controlled detonations. Friends called the decision foolish, a waste of rare talent, trading real currency for counterfeit, as one put it. His relatives accused him not of being wrong, but of being secretive, wounded that he had not consulted them before making so drastic a choice. For weeks they fixated on this secondary grievance, unable to address the primary one. Schweitzer found their deflection exhausting. They could not say, "Don't go," without sounding selfish. So instead they said, "You should have told us," which sounded like concern but functioned as control. Widor, his beloved organ teacher, who had treated Schweitzer almost as a son, reproached him with a military metaphor. "You are a general who insists on going to war, carrying a rifle." The meaning was clear. A mind of Schweitzer's caliber should command from a distance, write, lecture, raise money, influence policy. To physically go to Africa and treat patients with his own hands was, in Widor's view, a misallocation of resources. A modern woman told him the same thing more bluntly. Action is outdated. Propaganda is what matters now. Go on speaking tours. Raise awareness. Let someone less gifted do the manual labor. Schweitzer listened to all of this with a patience that cost him more than anyone suspected. He did not dismiss their arguments. He understood the logic perfectly. A man who can move 1,000 people with a lecture reaches further than a man who treats 40 patients a day in a jungle clearing. The math was obvious, but the math missed something. Schweitzer did not want to reach further. He wanted to reach one person at a time with his own hands, in a place where no one else was willing to go. The distance between a lecture hall and a sickbed was not a matter of efficiency. It was a matter of what the soul requires in order to remain honest with itself. Some critics attributed his decision to professional disappointment, a theory that collapsed under the weight of his resume. Others guessed romantic failure. A few, claiming to speak from Christian conviction, called him a fantasist and accused him of misreading the Gospels. This last charge stung worst. He had expected that people who profess to follow Jesus would recognize the impulse behind his choice. Instead, they treated radical obedience to their own scripture as evidence of instability. What almost no one saw was the woman standing beside him. Helene Breslau was the daughter of Harry Breslau, a Jewish historian at the University of Strasbourg. She had studied history, art, philosophy, and theology. In 1908, she had established one of Europe's first shelters for unwed mothers. She was not a woman who followed. She was a woman who had been walking in the same direction all along. When Schweitzer told her of his plan to go to Africa, she did not try to dissuade him. She resigned her post as inspector of city orphanages and enrolled in a rigorous 2-year nursing program in Frankfurt, training specifically so she could work at his side. They married on June 18, 1912, in Gunsbach, his father officiating, at ages 37 and 33. Neither was young, neither was reckless. They had exchanged over 600 letters across a decade of friendship before arriving at this point. Their courtship had been a long, careful negotiation between two independent minds who happened to share the same destination. On Good Friday, 1913, they boarded a ship in Bordeaux bound for French equatorial Africa. The date was not accidental. In Christian tradition, Good Friday is the day of crucifixion, the day a man walks willingly toward suffering he did not cause and cannot escape. Schweitzer never said publicly why he chose that day. He did not need to. The calendar spoke for itself. The mailbox on that Paris boulevard had swallowed 7 envelopes. What it released was a life. Chapter 6. The Chicken Coop and the Operating Table. A former chicken coop stands at the edge of a mission station in Lambaréné, on the banks of the Ogowe River in French equatorial Africa. The year is 1913. Inside the coop, a man who holds doctorates in philosophy and theology is examining his first African patient. The examining table is improvised. The light is poor. A former cook stands nearby, translating the patient's words from a local language into French. The smell of livestock has not entirely left the walls. This is the Albert Schweitzer Hospital on its first day of operation. Within weeks, the coop was overwhelmed. Patients arrived from villages up and down the river, traveling for days by canoe through dense equatorial forest, bringing with them family members who expected to stay, because in this part of the world, no one was sick alone. A patient came with a companion. The companion needed shelter, food, a place to sleep while the treatment lasted. Schweitzer was not running a clinic. He was running a small, chaotic, improvised village, organized around the principle that suffering deserved a response. Helene worked beside him from the beginning. The locals called her Madame Docteur because the distinction between doctor and nurse meant nothing when there were only 2 Europeans in the building. She managed sterilization, prepared surgical instruments, administered anesthesia, monitored post-operative patients, and supervised the washing of bandages, all of it in equatorial heat, with supply shipments arriving months late when they arrived at all. Only the patients' quarters had electricity. Staff worked, ate, and studied by the light of kerosene lamps. The building stood on stilts to keep rainwater from seeping in. Termites ate the wood. Humidity rusted the instruments. Tropical diseases arrived in combinations that European textbooks had never described. Schweitzer treated hernias, tropical dysentery, sleeping sickness, malaria, leprosy, and infections that had been left untreated for so long that the body had restructured itself around the damage. He operated on patients who had never seen a scalpel, in a room where the walls had recently housed poultry, and somehow, through competence, stubbornness, and what can only be called moral momentum, the early surgeries succeeded. Word spread. The daily patient count climbed to 40. He established one rule that visitors found puzzling. Local patients were expected to contribute something in return for treatment. Not money necessarily. A few bananas, an egg, a chicken, a small handful of coins. The amount was symbolic. The principle was not. Schweitzer believed that receiving care as pure charity would hollow out the relationship between doctor and patient, turning one into a benefactor and the other into a dependent. If patients contributed even a token, they became participants. The hospital became theirs, too. Not everyone understood this logic. Members of some remote tribes, upon being discharged, turned to Schweitzer and asked for a gift, because, they explained, they had become friends during the treatment, and friends exchange presents. The request reversed every European assumption about aid. The doctor had assumed he was giving. The patient had assumed they were sharing. Conversations with these patients surprised Schweitzer more than the diseases did. He had come expecting to find people with limited intellectual horizons. Instead, he found men and women who asked probing questions about the meaning of life, the nature of good and evil, the reasons for suffering. Questions that European philosophers had been circling for centuries without resolution. The assumption that these people were primitive dissolved on contact with their actual minds. Then the war came. In August 1914, word reached the jungle that Europe had ignited. An elderly African man, hearing that 10 white men had already been killed in fighting along the Ogowe, expressed his bewilderment. Why can the two tribes not sit down and talk it out? And who is going to pay the death compensation? In African warfare, both sides, winners and losers, were required to pay reparations for every life lost. The old man continued, reasoning aloud, that Europeans must kill each other out of sheer cruelty, since they did not even eat the dead. The remark landed in Schweitzer's mind and stayed. He had crossed an ocean to bring civilization to Africa, and now Africa was asking, with perfect reasonableness, whether civilization was something Europe actually possessed. The chicken coop had become a mirror. Chapter 7. The Hippos at Sunset. A barge moves upstream on the Ogowe River. It is September 1915. The dry season has lowered the water, and the vessel creeps between sandbanks, its engine straining against a current that seems unwilling to let anything pass. On the deck sits a man with a stack of loose paper and a pencil. He writes a sentence, crosses it out, writes another. The sentences do not connect. They are fragments, pieces of a thought that refuses to assemble itself into a whole. Albert Schweitzer had been called upriver to treat the ailing wife of a missionary at Ngomo, 160 miles from Lambaréné. The only available transport was this overloaded steamboat towing 2 barges. His fellow passengers were all African. One, a friend named Emile Oguma, shared his food with the doctor, who had left in too much haste to pack provisions. The trip would take 3 days. Schweitzer used every waking hour to think. The problem consuming him was not medical. It was philosophical, and it had been grinding at him for months. He was trying to find what he called the elementary and universal concept of the ethical, a foundation for morality that did not depend on any particular religion, any cultural tradition, any historical accident. Western philosophy had failed to produce one. Every system he examined, Kant's duty, the utilitarian's calculations, the Stoics' resignation, offered partial answers that collapsed under pressure. They defined goodness in terms that were too narrow, too abstract, too detached from the pulse of actual living. He had been working on a book about the decline of civilization, initially titled, "We Inheritors of the Past." The argument was that European culture had divorced its material progress from its ethical foundations, that the engine of modernity was running without a steering mechanism. The war now raging across Europe had confirmed this diagnosis with catastrophic precision. But diagnosis was not enough. Schweitzer wanted a cure. He wanted to identify the principle on which civilization could be rebuilt. And every path he followed into the philosophical literature ended at a locked gate. He described the experience later with a single image, pushing against an iron door in a thicket, pushing with all his strength and the door not moving. The ethical concepts available to him felt, in his word, lifeless. They treated goodness as an idea to be argued rather than a force to be felt. They had no roots in the body, no connection to the visceral fact of being alive. He kept writing his fragments on the deck of the barge, not because he was making progress, but because the act of writing kept the question from slipping away entirely. 2 days passed. The river bent and straightened. The forest pressed close on both sides, dense and indifferent. On the evening of the 3rd day, the sun dropped toward the horizon, turning the water copper and gold. The barge rounded a bend and entered a stretch of river occupied by a herd of hippopotamuses. The animals moved slowly through the shallows, their massive bodies half submerged, their eyes level with the surface. The boat passed among them. And in that moment, not before, not after, but precisely as the light touched the water and the animals drifted past, 3 words surfaced in Schweitzer's mind: Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben. Reverence for life. He had not reasoned his way to the phrase. It arrived the way a note arrives when an organist lifts his fingers and the pipe speaks. Not produced but released, as though it had been waiting inside the instrument all along. The iron door opened. The path through the thicket became visible. He understood with a certainty that felt physical that the starting point of all ethics was not a principle, not a duty, not a calculation, but a recognition. I am life that wills to live, surrounded by life that wills to live. The moment a thinking person becomes fully conscious of this, not as an idea, but as an experience, the ethical response is not optional. It is inevitable. To maintain, assist, and enhance life is good. To damage, obstruct, or destroy life is evil. There is no further axiom needed. The German word Ehrfurcht carries weight that reverence cannot fully translate. It contains awe, fear, and devotion compressed into a single syllable. The feeling a person has standing at the edge of something immeasurably larger than themselves. Schweitzer did not choose the word. The word chose him on a river, among hippos, in the failing light of an African evening. He spent the rest of the voyage writing. The fragments on the loose pages began, for the first time, to cohere. Some doors do not yield to force. They yield to exhaustion. The moment you stop pushing and simply stand still long enough to hear the lock turn from the other side. Chapter 8. The Prisoner Who Kept Writing. A French military officer opens a suitcase and pulls out a book. It is a French translation of Aristotle's Politics. He holds it up and shouts at the prisoner who owns it. The prisoner, a 42-year-old doctor with a calm face and round spectacles, explains that the book was written before the birth of Christ. The officer turns to a subordinate, who confirms this is true. After a pause, the officer allows the book to remain. The year is 1917. The place is a transit camp in Bordeaux. The prisoner is Albert Schweitzer. When the war broke out in 1914, Schweitzer and Helene had been placed under house arrest at Lambaréné as enemy aliens, German citizens on French colonial soil. African soldiers were assigned to guard them. The villagers found this arrangement incomprehensible. They scolded the guards openly, refusing to accept that black soldiers could have authority over the white doctor who had treated their families. Schweitzer, confined to quarters, unable to practice medicine, did the only thing left available to him. He sat at his desk and began writing The Philosophy of Civilization. In September 1917, the couple received orders to leave Africa. They were given days to prepare. Schweitzer packed medicines and instruments into a small iron shed, hoping to return. His manuscript, hundreds of handwritten pages on civilization, ethics, and the crisis of modern thought, posed a different problem. If he carried it, French inspectors would likely confiscate it. He entrusted the pages to an American missionary named Mr. Ford, who worked at Lambaréné. Ford told him bluntly that philosophy was worthless and harmful, but agreed to keep the manuscript safe and return it after the war. Schweitzer, uncertain whether this promise would hold, spent 2 nights writing a summary in French, disguised with chapter headings that made it resemble a study of Renaissance history. The deception worked. Inspectors passed over it without interest. On the day of departure, with crates half packed around him, Schweitzer performed one final surgery, a strangulated hernia, operating between sealed and unsealed boxes. Local people gathered on the riverbank to say goodbye. A Catholic mission leader boarded the steamboat to shake his hand. At Cape Lopez, a white stranger, worried that the prisoners had no money, pressed gold coins into Schweitzer's palm. He had sewn his own emergency francs into the lining of his coat the hour before boarding. The ocean crossing delivered them to Bordeaux, where they were held for 3 weeks in a temporary military camp. Schweitzer contracted dysentery. He treated himself with medicine from his luggage, but the illness left a permanent mark on his health. From Bordeaux, they were transferred to Garaison, a former monastery in the Pyrenees that had been converted into an internment camp. Hundreds of men, women, and children from enemy nations crowded into crumbling halls. It was here that Schweitzer discovered something unexpected. A fellow prisoner named Bogner approached him on his second day, introduced himself as a factory foreman, and asked if he needed help. Schweitzer remembered treating the man's wife years before. Bogner had not forgotten. He gave Schweitzer a table. With a table, the doctor could write. With a table, he could lay his hands flat and practice organ fingering on the wooden surface, keeping his technique alive through silent rehearsal on dead wood. A group of Romani musicians arrived in the camp. Their leader asked Schweitzer if he was the Albert Schweitzer mentioned in Romain Rolland's book on contemporary musicians. When Schweitzer confirmed it, the old man declared he would treat the doctor as one of his own. On Helene's birthday, she was awakened by a waltz from the Tales of Hoffmann, played beneath her window with passionate precision by men who had lost everything except their instruments. A dispute over the camp kitchen produced a parable Schweitzer never forgot. New arrivals complained that the food was terrible and the cooks incompetent. They demanded control of the kitchen. The camp commander asked if any of the complainers were professional cooks. None were. They were cobblers, tailors, hat makers, but they had cooked in their previous camp, they said, and had learned a secret. The commander gave them 2 weeks. Their food was better. Schweitzer asked the cobbler-turned-chef for his secret. The man answered, "A person should know a little about everything. But the most important thing is, you have to cook with love and attention." From that day forward, Schweitzer wrote, he never again resented it when an unqualified person was appointed to an important position. He simply hoped the person would prove worthy of the trust. Months later, the couple was transferred to Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, to another repurposed building. Walking into the ground-floor dormitory, Schweitzer felt a flash of recognition. The iron stove, the long pipe running across the ceiling, the stone floor radiating cold. He had seen this room before, in a painting. Vincent van Gogh had been confined to this same building, the former monastery of Saint-Paul de Moselle, 30 years earlier, and had rendered its corridors in pencil and oil. Van Gogh had painted the Starry Night and irises within these walls. He had paced the same high-walled garden, circling endlessly, staring at the same strip of sky. 2 men, separated by 3 decades, imprisoned in the same stone room. One turned inward until the turning consumed him. The other turned outward and wrote a philosophy of civilization on a borrowed table. The building did not determine the outcome. The person inside it did. Chapter 9. The Civilization That Forgot to Think. A room full of educated people in Strasbourg, 1899. The host is Professor Courteous. The guests are scholars, writers, men accustomed to measuring the world with precision. The conversation drifts, as such conversations do, toward the state of things, progress, achievement, the century drawing to its close. Someone speaks a sentence that lands in the room like a stone thrown through glass. So it turns out we are all just second-rate followers of the past. The others laugh or shrug. Schweitzer, 24 years old, does neither. The sentence has named something he has felt since his first year at university, but has never been able to articulate. He had been watching his generation congratulate itself. The 19th century was ending in a mood of extraordinary confidence. Invention was accelerating. Literacy was spreading. Colonial empires were extending the reach of European institutions to every continent. Almost everyone around him believed that humanity had achieved a height of intellectual and moral development unprecedented in history. Schweitzer looked at the same evidence and saw something different. He saw a civilization that had mistaken velocity for direction, a society moving faster than ever before without asking where it was going. The symptoms were not hidden. Superstition, once driven to the margins by the Enlightenment, was creeping back into educated circles. Nationalist rhetoric was becoming sharper, meaner, more willing to justify violence against outsiders. Political discourse had adopted a new vocabulary, realpolitik, which dressed up short-sightedness as pragmatism and moral compromise as maturity. The idealism of earlier generations was treated not as a foundation to build upon, but as an embarrassment to outgrow. Schweitzer watched this process with the helpless clarity of a physician observing the early stages of a disease that the patient refuses to acknowledge. He began quietly to formulate a thesis. Civilization, he argued, is not a condition produced by technology or wealth. It is the continuous ethical refinement of individuals and societies. Material progress matters, but only when guided by an ethical compass. Without that compass, progress becomes a machine that manufactures power without purpose. An engine running at full speed with no one at the wheel. The generation that believed progress was self-sustaining, that knowledge and industry alone could carry humanity forward, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The First World War was the receipt for that error. His thinking reached further back. He studied the great ethical turning points in human history and found a remarkable convergence. Between the 8th and 6th centuries before Christ, three thinkers, the Jewish prophet Amos, the Persian sage Zarathustra, and the Chinese philosopher Confucius, arrived independently at a shared conclusion. Ethics was not the obedience of inherited custom. It was the active commitment of individuals to the welfare of others and the improvement of the conditions in which all people live. These men lived in different civilizations, spoke different languages, knew nothing of each other's existence. Yet they reached the same moral ground, as though the idea had been waiting in the structure of human consciousness for someone to name it. This convergence gave Schweitzer confidence that his intuition about reverence for life was not a private invention, but a recovery, the rediscovery of a principle that every major ethical tradition had touched, however briefly, before losing hold of it. Christianity, in its early centuries, had been so focused on the coming end of the world that it had little interest in improving this one. Only after the Reformation and the Enlightenment did Christian thought begin to affirm earthly life and align itself with the forces of civilization. That alignment had produced 3 centuries of remarkable progress. But the alliance was fragile, and by the late 19th century it was already fracturing. Schweitzer did not live to see the full unfolding of his warning, but its arc extended far beyond his death. He watched the atomic bomb arrive and understood immediately what it meant, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. A civilization capable of splitting the atom, but incapable of agreeing not to use the result against civilian populations, had lost its ethical bearings completely. In 1954, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, he issued a direct warning against nuclear proliferation. In 1958, he broadcast 3 radio appeals titled Peace or Atomic War. He joined his voice with Einstein's and Russell's, arguing that the survival of the species now depended on the same principle he had identified on the Ogowe River 4 decades earlier, that all life, without exception, demands reverence. His final frustration was not illness or age. It was the knowledge that the world had heard his argument, admired it, praised it, and continued building bombs. The iron door he had opened on the river remained open. The civilization he had tried to redirect kept walking past it. The engine is still running. The wheel is still unmanned. The question is whether anyone alive today is willing to reach for it. Chapter 10. The Drums That Lasted Months. An old man sits at a wooden desk in a hospital on the banks of the Ogowe River. He is in his 80s. His hair is white. His hands, which once played Bach fugues in the concert halls of Europe, now tremble slightly when he lifts a pen. The desk is piled with correspondence from strangers, letters from school children, theologians, politicians, patients he treated decades ago. He answers as many as he can. The kerosene lamp burns late. The jungle presses against the windows with its permanent, unhurried dark. Albert Schweitzer had written, at the age of 56, a passage of self-assessment so honest that it reads like a man preparing his own eulogy. His hair was graying. His body showed fatigue. He wondered how many of his plans he would live to complete. He recalled a time when physical effort cost him nothing, when he could spend himself without counting the change. He accepted that those days were gone. And then he added a sentence that carries more weight than anything in his philosophical writings. Whether as one who acts or as one who suffers, we must all find the courage. He did not expect to reach 90. He credited whatever force governs such things with the belief that he still had work to do. And he did. In the decades after writing those words, he returned to Lambaréné 10 more times. He used the $33,000 from the Nobel Peace Prize not to improve his own comfort, but to build a village for leprosy patients, people rejected by their communities, untouchable, exiled from every circle of human warmth. He gave the money, all of it, to the people the rest of the world would not look at. Helene died in 1957. After her death, Schweitzer did not return to Europe. He remained at Lambaréné, beside the river, beside the hospital they had built from a chicken coop into a sprawling compound of wards and kitchens and gardens. She was buried on the hospital grounds. He would join her there. In his 80s, a local man said to him, "Old doctor, when you die, the mourning drums will probably last a week." Schweitzer laughed and replied that at least by then he would be deaf enough not to mind. It was the kind of joke a man makes when he has spent so long among people that he has absorbed their rhythm of speech, their way of measuring a life not by its publications or prizes, but by the sound it leaves in the air after it ends. On September 4, 1965, in the deep hours of a tropical night, Schweitzer died at Lambaréné. He was 90 years old. He was buried beside Helen, under a cross he had made with his own hands. The mourning drums did not last a week. They lasted months. People came from villages scattered across the forest, traveling through the night on foot, arriving at dawn to stand at his grave and sing. Adults and children together, their voices rising in the gray light before the heat of the day closed in. Some had walked for hours through dense jungle in total darkness to be there when the sun came up. They were not mourners in the European sense. They were witnesses, people whose bodies bore the evidence of what one man's hands had done, and who understood, without needing philosophy to explain it, that something unrepeatable had left the world. He had written, near the end of his life, that every person has their own Lambaréné. The sentence is easy to admire and difficult to obey. It means that the place where your conscience meets your capability, the place where what you can do intersects with what clearly needs doing, already exists. You do not need to cross an ocean. You do not need a medical degree, or a theology doctorate, or a concert stage. You need only the willingness to stop walking past what you have already seen. Going to Lambaréné to build a hospital for people in pain is worthy of admiration. But equally important, Schweitzer insisted, is beginning where you are, at your own post, among the people already near you, in whatever quiet corner of the world your life has placed you. The scale does not matter. What matters is that you acted, that you reduced by even a fraction the weight of suffering or fear that another living being was carrying. Even if what you do is small, it is not insignificant. The drums stopped eventually. The singing faded. The jungle reclaimed its silence. But somewhere, in a hospital that still stands on the banks of the Ogowe, in the letters he answered by kerosene light, in the memory of a smile on a donkey rider's face, in the word Erfurcht whispered on a river at sunset, the sound continues, not as noise, as resonance, the kind that enters the structure of things and does not leave. If this made the world look slightly different, if some corner of it shifted, even by a degree, stay. There is more coming. And tonight, before you sleep, consider this. You already know the place where your conscience meets your capability. You have seen it. You have walked past it. The only question left is whether you will keep walking.